I bought the Sony ZV-1 Mark II a couple of years ago as one of my main cameras for shooting YouTube videos, but it has some limitations that have been bugging me throughout my journey. All of those limitations are addressed with the new Canon V1, but Canon is more costly, so the question is whether it makes sense to sacrifice weight and money to get the Canon, especially since the two cameras have a lot of similarities. For example, they are both compact and almost pocketable, they both have smaller sensor sizes. Canon's sensor is almost macro 4/3, and Sony has a 1-inch sensor, which is smaller. They both have a built-in ND filter, which is my favorite part of both cameras, and the reason I do recommend them for shooting outside. ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera, and they are essential for bright environments. The lenses have similar focal length. Canon is slightly wider at 16 to 50mm, while Sony is 18 to 50mm. In practical terms, the difference is negligible, especially if you use Canon at a maximum stabilization, which adds a bit of crop to your footage. You can change the lens on either of these cameras. Sony's minimum f-stop is 1.8 and goes all the way to 4, while Canon starts at 2.8 and goes to 4.5. Neither has optical stabilization. Canon has a larger body, allowing it to have more buttons and functions than Sony. It also has a larger display. On top, you get a dial to change the camera mode, a shutter button plus zoom rockers, and a video record button. On the back of the device, there are 4 function buttons, a dial with 4 buttons, and a set button in the middle. On the side, there are mic and headphones jacks. Sony does not have a headphone jack, and you also get USB-C and micro HDMI. Sony's body is more simple, with the same record and shutter buttons plus a zoom rocker, but instead of a dial for changing modes, you only have one single button to switch between video, photo, and SAQ mode, plus an action button. On the back, you get exactly the same number of buttons and dials at the Canon. On the side, there is a micro HDMI and a USB-C port, plus audio input, but the headphone jacks is missing. One big problem with Canon is that the screw can block the battery and SD card slot, but for Sony it does not. This is going to be super annoying for me because I have to constantly remove my quick release when I want to change the SD card. On the bright side, the Canon has better battery life compared to Sony, since the battery is simply larger. With Sony, you have to change the battery every 40 to 60 minutes of video recording in 4K, but with Canon, you can do it every 60 to 80 minutes solely based on my personal experience. One of the things about Canon is that it is also larger. It may sound like a big problem because both of them are quite small, but the difference is that for Sony, you can put it in almost any pocket that you want. Whereas for Canon, I found that there are some pockets on my trouser or on my jacket that it doesn't actually fit. In general, Sony is a truly compact camera, and even though it is a bit thicker than your phone, it still fits into most of my pockets. For Canon, I have a hard time fitting it into my pockets other than my jackets. One of the main selling points of Canon is that it also has a fan built in. If you've never gotten a heating error on your cameras, then you are safe to get the Sony. But if you, like me, spend time outside and shoot 10 to 20 minutes non-stop under the sun, you'd better look at Canon. One of the main reasons that you may want to buy the Canon instead of the Sony is the color science behind it. Sony is famous for not giving the best skin tones, whereas Canon is usually a better choice when it comes to skin tones and the colors you get from the camera in general. I personally try to shoot in the neutral look profile on Canon because the standard profile over-sharpens the image. Sony also has many color profiles that you can choose from. Sony always shoots in 8-bit, and Canon's standard profile are also 8-bit. For stabilization and vlogging, Sony can be a decent choice. As I mentioned, usually the skin tones are not super great, and I keep seeing magenta or greens on their face. Tanya is shooting this video in auto mode on Sony ZV-1 Mark II. It's a bit personal taste, but Canon usually gets the skin tones better compared to Sony. In auto mode, the video is a bit more exposed compared to Sony, and I do feel Sony, generally speaking, manages exposure shifts better. But even on the 8-bit default profile, they both have a good amount of dynamic range and good enough stabilization. You can check the quality of the footage from both cameras in neutral look on Canon and picture profile 1 on Sony. This is the maximum zoom on both cameras, and as you can see, the bokeh you get is similar since the Canon has a larger sensor, but the f-stop on the Sony is lower, therefore they almost counter each other. For me personally, the main difference between the Canon and Sony, and the reason that I decided to upgrade, is that Canon also have a 10-bit profile, whereas on Sony you can only shoot on 8-bit. Also on Canon, on the normal profile, you are going to shoot on 8-bit, but you have two options. You can either shoot in PQ mode, HDR PQ mode, or you can also shoot in CLOG3, which is a 10-bit flat profile. For Canon, I always shoot in PQ HDR mode, which you can activate in the setting. Since CLOG3 is sometimes difficult for exposure, the PQ HDR gives a rather flat look to the footage, and you definitely want to color grade it later in Adobe Premiere or DaVinci Resolve. I personally always decrease the shadows and blacks and also increase the vividness of the footage. On top of the PQ HDR mode, you can also shoot in Canon CLOG3. Personally, I shoot in Cinema Gamut. The CLOG3 is very flat, meaning the contrast is very low and the shades of gray are very close to each other. You also need to color grade this footage, for example by using the default lookup table from Canon, which I used here. This color profile gives you the best flexibility and dynamic range. They both also have a built-in microphone with a dead cat already included in the box for wind noise. Let's check the mic quality of each of them.
If you're happy and you know it, comment this post. If you're happy and you know it, comment this video. If you're happy and you know it and you really want to show it, then subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Hi-ya!
Now you should continue talking because we're testing the microphone.
Okay, we are testing the microphone.
What do you think about the cameras? Which one is your favorite?
They're both cute. I feel like the Sony one is much smaller for me to feel like I can handle it. I don't know, the Canon feels more normal in my...
So you're saying that the Canon is too big for you?
No, I say I like the Canon because the Sony is too small.
One win for Sony is that I do experience better autofocus on it. It is not uncommon on the Canon V1 to experience some sort of focus hunting, even for a simple scene like capturing these spring flowers. Sony in general is famous for its great autofocus in the industry. For pictures, I took this one with the lowest possible focal length in auto mode. Again, we see that Canon, in my opinion, shows better skin tones and processing in general. That said, you may prefer the Sony picture at the highest focal length and maximum zoom. They both created a similar amount of bokeh, maybe Canon slightly more than Sony. In general, Canon, in my experience, at least in auto mode, exposes both videos and photos more compared to Sony. For Sony, the color profile that I'm going to miss a lot is the gold cinematic one. I just love the colors coming out of it, but unfortunately it always adds these bars to your footage, and also you can't go above 24 frames per second. You probably already know that Sony has a 1-inch sensor and the Canon sensor is much larger, but you should also note that Sony can go to f1.8, whereas on the Canon it is f2.8. So if you multiply them, it's not like that on Sony you get much less light compared to Canon. And in real life, I sometimes do feel that Sony actually has better low light performance compared to Canon. Or at worst, they are both similar in terms of low light performance. Therefore, I would not advise choosing either one over the other solely for low light performance. I know I gave a lot of information, but here is the important part. If you are not going to color grade your footage and only use what you are getting directly out of the camera, there isn't much difference in footage quality between the two. Canon has more buttons, an extra headphone input, and a built-in fan, but it is also heavier and less pocketable. If you actually do plan to color grade your footage using Canon CLOG3 or HDR PQ mode, Canon gives you much more flexibility for that. I personally opted for the Canon V1, and I'm going to sell the Sony ZV-1 Mark II because I do like to color grade my footage. Maybe you can also just keep your phone for now instead of buying a camera, and if you want to see if your phone is capable enough, you can watch this video next. Thanks for tuning in to TechMo, and I will see you in the next one.